$12 million does not disappear by accident, Daniel Carter said quietly, his voice low but sharp enough to silence the entire room as Rain traced slow lines across the glass behind him, and the red numbers on the screen reflected in his eyes like something burning from the inside out. And no one answered because no one could, because in that moment the most powerful man in the room had no control, and everyone could feel it as he stood there perfectly still, jaw tight, fingers resting on the table as if holding himself together, the silence stretching longer than it should until he turned, picked up his coat, and walked out without another word. The sound of the door closing softer than expected, but heavier than anything he had said that morning as the city swallowed him whole, neon lights blurred by rain, the world outside moving as if nothing had just collapsed. And 20 minutes later, he pushed open the door of a small diner that smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread, a place too ordinary to know his name. And that was exactly why he chose it, as Emily Brooks stood behind the counter, wiping a glass slowly, her movements calm, almost deliberate, her eyes lifting for only a second before returning to her work, not impressed, not curious, just present in a way that felt different as Daniel slid into a booth and dropped his phone onto the table, the screen lighting up again with messages, numbers, losses, explanations that sounded like excuses, and he exhaled. Slowly, running a hand through his hair as if trying to reset something inside his head while Emily approached, placing a cup of coffee in front of him without asking, the steam rising between them like a quiet boundary, and for a moment neither spoke until his phone rang again, and this time he answered, his voice sharper now, controlled but cracking at the edges as he spoke about projections, about markets, about variables that had shifted overnight, about decisions that should have worked and did not. And Emily did not look at him, but she listened, not to the words, but to the spaces between them, the pauses, the assumptions hidden inside certainty. And when he finally ended the call, he let out a breath that sounded almost like defeat, staring into the coffee as if it might answer him, and she turned slightly, just enough, her voice soft but clear when she spoke. Markets do not fail people. And the words hung there, simple, almost too simple, and Daniel looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in confusion, as if something small had just shifted in a way he did not yet understand. And for the first time that day, he was not thinking about millions, he was thinking about one sentence he could not immediately dismiss as he leaned back slightly, studying her now, really looking, noticing the way she stood, relaxed but aware, the kind of stillness that came from knowing more than you said, and something in him resisted, instinctively, because men like him were not used to being corrected, especially not by someone in a uniform he had spent his entire life overlooking. Yet he did not look away, and she did not either, and the room felt quieter than before, as if something unseen had just begun and neither of them had decided what it would become yet. Daniel let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it as he leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. And what does that mean? He asked, his tone controlled but edged with something sharper, something that had not yet decided if it was irritation or curiosity, as Emily set the glass aside and faced him more directly, not defensive, not hesitant, just present in a way that felt unusually steady for someone standing across from a man like him. It means, she said quietly, you are blaming the wrong thing. And the simplicity of it landed harder than any complex explanation could have as Daniel's eyes narrowed again, this time more focused, his mind already moving through possibilities, dismissals, arguments he could use to shut this down because that was what he did. He dismantled things that did not fit his understanding, but something held him back, something about the way she had not tried to impress him, had not softened the statement, had not cared whether he agreed as he leaned back again, studying her like a problem he had not expected to encounter. You think you understand a situation you just overheard for 30 seconds, he said, his voice cooler now, testing, probing, and she did not react immediately. She let the silence sit for a second before answering. I think I heard enough. And again there was no arrogance in it, just clarity, which somehow made it more difficult to challenge as Daniel glanced down at his phone. The number's still there, unchanged, still wrong, and he felt that familiar frustration rise again, the one that came from losing control, from not being able to predict the outcome, from realizing that something in his system had failed and systems were not supposed to fail, not his systems, not the ones that had built everything he had. And yet here he was, sitting in a diner, being told by a waitress that he was looking at it incorrectly as he shook his head slightly, almost to himself. "You have no idea what you are talking about," he said, but the words did not carry the weight they usually did, not entirely. And Emily noticed that, not by what he said, but by how he said it as she reached for the coffee pot and refilled his cup without asking. The simple act grounding the moment back into something ordinary before she spoke again. "You said the market shifted overnight," she said, her tone calm, observational. "But markets do not shift without signals." And Daniel's gaze flickered up again, sharper now, because that was not wrong. That was never wrong. And he did not respond immediately, which was all the confirmation she needed as she continued. Not faster, not louder, just steady. "So either you ignored the signals, or you trusted the wrong ones." And this time the silence that followed was different, heavier, more focused as Daniel did not move, did not look away, because now this was not a random comment. This was a line of reasoning, and he could feel it, the structure forming beneath the simplicity, and for the first time. Since that morning, something inside his mind shifted direction slightly, not enough to change anything yet, but enough to stop the spiral he had been in as he leaned forward again, slower this time, more deliberate, his voice lower. "Explain that," he said, and this time it was not a challenge. It was a request he had not intended to make. Emily paused for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know what to say, but because she was deciding how much to say as she placed the coffee pot down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter in a small, precise movement before stepping closer to the table, still maintaining a comfortable distance, not crossing into his space, but not retreating either. "You mentioned allocation," she said, her voice soft but clear, "and exposure." And Daniel's eyes sharpened again, because those were not casual words, those were specific, intentional. And he could feel it now, the shift from assumption to attention as she continued. "If your loss happened that fast, then it was not the market alone," she said. "It was how you positioned yourself inside it." And he exhaled slowly, leaning back again, one hand resting against his chin now, a habit he had when he was thinking, really thinking, not reacting, not controlling, but analyzing as she spoke. "You said the numbers moved against you," she added. "But numbers do not move without pressure." And Daniel's mind immediately began reconstructing the scenario, the trades, the timing, the decision points where he had chosen one path over another, and for a moment, he almost interrupted her, almost dismissed it, because that was easier, because accepting this line of thought meant accepting that the loss had not been random, had not been external, had not been something he could simply blame on volatility or timing or bad luck. And that was a more uncomfortable truth than any financial loss as she watched him, not pushing, not filling the silence, just allowing him to process. And that was what made it work, because she was not trying to prove anything. She was letting him see it himself as he finally spoke again, slower now. "You were suggesting it was a structural error," he said, and she nodded once, a small movement, but enough, a perspective error, she corrected gently, and that distinction landed in a way he did not expect, because structural errors could be fixed with systems, with adjustments, with data, but perspective errors required something else, something less comfortable, something internal. As he let out another breath, this one longer, quieter, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to her. "And you think you can see that from one conversation," he said, but there was less resistance now, less dismissal, more curiosity as she met his gaze without hesitation. "I think," she said, "you already see it." And the words settled into the space between them like something inevitable as Daniel did not respond immediately, because she was right, not entirely, not completely, but enough that he could not ignore it. And for the first time since the loss, the problem did not feel like something outside of him. It felt like something he could understand, and that was more unsettling than anything else. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm against the glass, a quiet backdrop to the silence that now filled the space between them as Daniel's fingers rested still on the table, no longer tapping, no longer searching for something to control as he replayed the morning in his mind, not as it had felt in the moment, but as it actually happened, step by step, decision by decision. And he could see it now, not clearly yet, but enough to recognize that there had been a moment, a small one, almost insignificant at the time, where he had chosen confidence over caution, assumption over verification, speed over clarity. And that moment had multiplied, expanded, turned into something larger than it should have been as Emily watched him without interrupting, her presence steady, almost invisible now, like the background hum of the diner, the clink of dishes, the quiet conversations from other tables. Everything continuing as if this moment did not matter to anyone else, but to him it had become the only thing that mattered as he finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, more grounded. There was a signal, he said slowly, almost to himself, and she did not respond immediately. She let him continue. I saw it, he added, his brow tightening slightly as the memory sharpened. But I dismissed it, and there it was, the shift, the first real acknowledgement not just of the mistake, but of his role in it, as Emily nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. And that was enough as Daniel leaned back further, exhaling slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not gone, but different now, more focused, more contained as he looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a distraction, not as an interruption, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Where did you learn that? He asked, the question coming out before he had fully decided to ask it, and she paused again, just for a moment, her gaze shifting briefly toward the counter, toward a small shelf where a worn book rested, its edges slightly bent, its cover faded from use before she looked back at him, her expression unchanged. Observation, she said simply, and Daniel almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was incomplete, intentionally incomplete, and he recognized that, the way she had, recognized his earlier assumptions as he followed her gaze for a brief second, noticing the book now, noticing the details he had ignored before, the small signs that did not fit the narrative he had assigned to her as he returned his attention to her, his voice quieter now. That is not all, he said, and for the first time, she did not answer immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to suggest that there was more, much more, but that she had not yet decided whether to share it as. The moment lingered, balanced between what was known and what was not, and Daniel realized something unexpected, something he had not felt in a long time. He was not in control of this conversation, and for once, he did not try to take it back. Emily turned slightly and reached for the worn book on the shelf, her fingers brushing over its edge before she picked it up and placed it gently on the table between them. Not as an offering, not as proof, just as something that existed, and Daniel's eyes dropped to it instinctively, noticing the title, the annotations along the margins, the quiet evidence of hours spent thinking rather than speaking as she said, I used to study it, her voice calm, almost distant, before life changed direction, and she did not elaborate, did not dramatize it. And that restraint carried more weight than any explanation could as Daniel leaned forward slightly, flipping the cover open just enough to see notes written in careful handwriting, precise, intentional, the kind that did not belong to someone who guessed, but someone who understood as he looked back at her, something in his expression shifting again, less guarded now, more aware. You walked away from it, he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and she nodded once. Sometimes the timing is wrong, she replied, even when the path is right. And the simplicity of it landed in a place he had not expected, somewhere beyond business, beyond numbers, something quieter as he closed the book gently and slid it back toward her, not keeping it, not questioning it further, just acknowledging it in the only way that mattered as the silence returned. But it was no longer empty, it was filled with something else, something like understanding as Daniel finally reached for his phone again. But this time his movements were slower, more deliberate, his mind no longer reacting but reconstructing, reevaluating, tracing the decisions that had led him here, and he began to see it clearly now. The missed signal, the overconfidence, the moment where he had chosen certainty over curiosity, and he knew exactly what he needed to do differently as he stood up, not abruptly, not with the tension he had carried in earlier, but with a quiet clarity, his eyes meeting hers one last time. You did not fix my loss, he said, his voice steady. You showed me where it began, and she gave a small nod, as if that distinction mattered, because it did, and always had as he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. A watch. Clean, precise, unmistakably expensive, but he did not push it toward her, did not explain it, did not turn it into a transaction. He simply left it. There, an acknowledgement. Nothing more as he turned and walked toward the door, the rain still falling outside, the world unchanged, but something inside him undeniably different as the door closed behind him. The diner returned to its quiet rhythm, the hum of conversation, the soft clink of dishes, the ordinary flow of time continuing without interruption while Emily stood there for a moment, looking at the watch, not with desire, not with hesitation, just with quiet understanding before she picked it up and carried it back to the counter, placing it beside the register, not keeping it, not rejecting it, simply returning it to the space where things were settled properly as another customer called for coffee, and she turned, moving with the same calm precision as before, the moment already passing, already becoming something that would not be spoken about again, as hours later the rain stopped and the city lights reflected off wet streets. Daniel stood in his office once more, the screens alive again with numbers, but this time he did not rush, did not react. He paused, just for a second, long enough to question what he assumed, long enough to see what he had missed before, and when he made his next move, it was not driven by urgency, but by clarity as the shift began, small at first, almost invisible, but real, undeniably real as days turned into weeks, and the loss that had once defined the moment became something else entirely, a correction, a lesson, a quiet turning point that no one else fully understood because no one else had been sitting in that diner, no one else had heard that sentence. And Daniel did not speak about it, not in meetings, not in interviews, not even to himself in any direct way, but it stayed with him, in the pauses between decisions, in the moments where certainty felt too easy, in the space where listening replaced assumption as one evening. Without announcement, without attention, he returned to the diner, the same seat, the same quiet atmosphere, and Emily was there, just as before, moving through the space with that same calm presence as he sat down and she approached, placing a cup of coffee in front of him without asking in this time. He did not reach for his phone. He did not speak immediately. He simply nodded once, a small gesture, but enough, because some things did not need to be said twice. And as she turned to leave, he spoke. Just one sentence, simple, clear. I saw it this time. And she paused for a fraction of a second before nodding back, just as simply, just as quietly. And that was it. No applause, no recognition, no change in the world around them. Just a shift that existed between two people who understood something most others did not as the camera of the moment faded into stillness, into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life where nothing looked different, but everything had changed just enough to matter. Because sometimes the most important lessons are not the ones that make noise, they are the ones that change how you see without ever needing to be seen at all. The night had settled into something quieter when Daniel stepped back out onto the street, the air still carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt as reflections of city lights stretched across the wet pavement like unfinished thoughts. And for a moment he did not move. He simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, not rushing, not calculating, just present in a way that would have felt unfamiliar to him days ago as a car passed, tires cutting softly through shallow water, and he exhaled slowly, his mind not filled with numbers this time, but with something else, something slower, something that did not demand immediate action as he walked without direction for a few blocks. The rhythm of his steps matching the steady pulse of the city until he finally stopped beneath a streetlight, its glow soft and constant, and he realized something that did not come with a number attached to it, something that could not be measured in profit or loss, that the moment he had dismissed in that diner had not just corrected a mistake, it had revealed a pattern, a quiet habit of certainty that had followed him longer than he had noticed as he closed his eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in clarity. And when he opened them again, the world looked the same, but his attention did not. He noticed more, the small details, the subtle shifts, the things he had once considered irrelevant as the following morning unfolded differently than any before it, not because the meetings had changed, not because the stakes were lower, but because Daniel paused before speaking, listened before deciding, questioned before concluding, and it was subtle, almost invisible to those around him. But the outcomes began to shift, not dramatically at first, but enough enough to confirm what he had felt in that quiet moment across from a woman who had no title, no position, no reason to influence him other than the truth she chose to speak. As weeks passed, and the narrative around his loss began to change, internally first, then externally, not as a failure, but as a turning point, something that sharpened his approach, refined his thinking, anchored his decisions in something more grounded than confidence alone. As one evening, he found himself returning again, not out of necessity, not out of habit, but out of something he did not name. The diner unchanged, the same soft hum, the same quiet presence behind the counter. As Emily glanced up when the door opened, recognizing him not with surprise, not with curiosity, just with a small acknowledgement that required no words. As he sat in the same seat, and she brought the coffee without asking, placing it in front of him with the same steady motion as before, and this time the silence between them was not uncertain. It was understood. As he looked at her for a moment before speaking, his voice calm, without the edge it once carried. "Do you always listen that closely?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine question, and she considered it for a second, not rushing to answer, before saying, "Only when it matters," and he nodded slightly, accepting that without needing more. As he took a sip of the coffee, the warmth grounding him in the moment, and for a while they said nothing, not because there was nothing to say, but because not everything needed to be filled with words. As eventually he reached into his pocket and placed something small on the table, not the watch this time, but a folded piece of paper, sliding it toward her just slightly, not insisting, not explaining. As she looked at it, then at him, then back at the paper before opening it slowly, her expression unchanged as she read the single line written inside, a simple acknowledgement, not of her knowledge, not of what she had done, but of what he had learned. And when she looked up again, he was already standing, already turning toward the door, not waiting for a response, not expecting one. As the bell above the door chimed softly when he left, the sound blending into the quiet rhythm of the evening, while Emily folded the paper once more and placed it beside the register, not keeping it as something valuable, not discarding it as something meaningless, just letting it exist where it belonged. As another order came in and she moved, just as she always had, calm, precise, present. As outside the city continued without pause, unaware of the small shift that had taken place, the kind that does not announce itself, does not demand attention, but quietly changes the direction of something much larger. Because sometimes the most powerful change is not in what you gain, but in what you finally learn to see.